My wife cheated on me for 6 years with a stranger, but when I fell for his wife, and what happened next will shock you. Hello. Life was good, better than good, honestly. I owned a successful construction company that I'd built from scratch. My wife, Vicky, and I seemed to have it all, a big house, 2 nice cars, and the kind of love story people envied. We grew up together, both of us working shifts at my family's diner as teenagers. Back then, life was simpler, and so were we. Vicky had always been ambitious. She worked her way up from a compliance officer to a high-ranking position at a big firm, which meant frequent travel. I supported her despite the nagging insecurities I carried from my past. My dad cheated on my mom, and the kind of thing leaves scars, even if you don't want to admit it. But I trusted Vicky. She was my partner, my rock. Then Jasmine walked into my life. She was a new client looking to remodel her home. I remember our first meeting at her place vividly, not because of her, but because of what I saw there. On her mantle was a photo of her husband, Steve, and my wife, Vicky. The picture was from last summer, a time when Vicky claimed she was on a work trip. In the photo, they were smiling at some resort, Steve's arm casually draped around Vicky's shoulders. I froze. Jasmine must have noticed because she asked if I was okay. I played it off, but my mind was spinning. Why was my wife in a photo with her husband? Why hadn't she mentioned it? Later that evening, I confronted Vicky. Hey, do you know a guy named Steve? I asked, keeping my voice calm. Her reaction was instant. She hesitated, a flicker of panic crossed her face before she said, Steve? No, doesn't ring a bell. Why? That's when I knew something was wrong. Vicky never hesitated, she was sharp, quick with her answers. That split-second pause planted a seed of doubt I couldn't shake. I reached out to Jasmine the next day, under the guise of discussing her remodel. Casually, I brought up the photo. That picture on your mantle, the one with your husband and a bunch of people, where was it taken? I asked. Jasmine frowned. Oh, you mean the one at the resort? That was in Cancun last July. Why? I said, forcing a smile. It looked like a fun trip. It all lined up. Last July, Vicky was supposed to be at a conference in Atlanta, except now I knew she wasn't. That night, as Vicky packed for another business trip, I decided to take action. I reached out to Jasmine again, and together we hired a private investigator. If Vicky was lying, I needed to know the truth. What I found would unravel everything I thought I knew about my wife and the life we built together. The private investigator was discreet and professional, a guy named Mike who'd seen it all. When Jasmine and I explained the situation, he nodded like this was just another Tuesday for him. Give me a couple of weeks, he said. I'll dig into their travel records, phone logs, and anything else that pops up. Jasmine and I exchanged a look. Weeks felt like an eternity, but we agreed to wait. Meanwhile, life at home became unbearable. Vicky acted normal, too normal. She had that effortless charm she always carried, but now every smile, every laugh, felt rehearsed. When she kissed me goodbye before her trip, it felt hollow, like a ghost of the love we used to share. I watched her drive off, a pit forming in my stomach. That night, I called my best friend, Carl. He's the guy I always leaned on for advice, the one who'd been my best man at our wedding. I didn't go into detail, just told him I had a feeling something wasn't right with Vicky. You think she's cheating? Carl asked bluntly, his tone matter of fact. I don't know, man, I replied, pacing the living room. But I saw this picture, and her reaction when I asked about it. It didn't sit right. Look, Carl said, don't jump to conclusions. But if you're already feeling like this, there's probably a reason. I wanted him to tell me I was overthinking it, that it was all in my head, but he didn't. And deep down, I appreciated his honesty. The days crawled by. I threw myself into work, hammering out contracts and overseeing projects just to keep my mind busy. Jasmine, on the other hand, seemed more composed than me. She texted updates now and then, like any word from Mike? Or how's everything on your end? It was strange, finding comfort in someone I barely knew, but we were in this together now. A week later, Mike called. Don, we need to meet. I've got something. My heart sank. If he'd found nothing, he would have just said so over the phone. Meeting in person meant it wasn't good. We met at a coffee shop, and Jasmine was already there when I arrived. Her face was tense, her usual calm demeanor cracking just a bit. Mike didn't waste time. He slid a manila folder across the table. Here's what I've got so far: hotel bookings, flight records, and surveillance photos. It's not everything, but it paints a pretty clear picture. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were flight itineraries showing Vicky and Steve booked on the same flights, destinations that didn't match her work trips. Photos of them walking into hotels together, arm in arm. My stomach churned as I flipped through the evidence. Jasmine was staring at the same folder, her hands gripping the edge of the table. 6 years, she said quietly. That's how long we've been married, and this has been going on for almost that long. 6 years. It hit me like a sledgehammer. Vicky and I had celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary last spring. For more than half of our marriage, she'd been living a double life. I looked at Mike, barely able to speak. How did they get away with it for so long? I asked. They were careful, he said. They only met in distant cities, booked separate rooms, and communicated through burner phones. Honestly, if it weren't for that photo you saw, you probably never would have found out. Jasmine closed the folder and leaned back, her expression hardening. So what's next? She asked. I couldn't even think that far ahead. My whole world had just been turned upside down. I don't know, I admitted. But I can't let this slide. Mike nodded. I'll keep digging. If you want a smoking gun, something you can take to court, I'll find it. As we left the coffee shop, Jasmine stopped me. Don, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I know this is hell for you, but at least we're not going through it alone. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of relief. She was right. I wasn't alone. Mike's call came a week later, and this time it wasn't just evidence. He'd recorded a conversation between Vicky and Steve. You're going to want to hear this, he told me. Jasmine was on the line too, and we decided to meet at her place to listen together. I sat on her couch, gripping the edge of the cushion while Mike set up his laptop. Jasmine handed me a glass of water, but my hands were too shaky to hold it steady. Let's get this over with, I muttered. The recording started, and there was Vicky's voice, familiar yet suddenly foreign. I can't believe we've kept this up for 6 years, she said, laughing softly. Steve chuckled in response. We're good at this, the secret rendezvous, the burner phones. It's kind of thrilling, isn't it? My jaw tightened as Vicky replied, that's why I did it, not because I wanted to be with you, but because I wanted to prove to myself and to Don that I could. My heart stopped. Jasmine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. What the hell does that even mean? She whispered. Steve sounded just as confused. What are you talking about? You remember that argument Don and I had years ago? Vicky said. He told me I wasn't capable of doing anything behind his back because he'd always find out. It just stuck with me. I wanted to see if I could prove him wrong, and I did. The room fell silent except for the sound of the recording. So this was all some kind of game to you? Steve asked, his tone incredulous. It wasn't about you, Vicky snapped. It was about me, about control. I needed to feel like I had the upper hand, even if he never knew about it. I couldn't listen anymore. I slammed the laptop shut and stood up, pacing the room. 6 years, I said, my voice trembling with anger. 6 years of lies, of betrayal, all because of some stupid argument. Jasmine stood too, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. And Steve, my husband, he just went along with it like it was no big deal, like it didn't matter that he was destroying 2 families. I couldn't sit still, my fists clenched at my sides. I had to fight the urge to punch the wall. Jasmine put a hand on my arm, grounding me. Dawn, she said softly, what are we going to do? The answer was clear, even though it hurt to say it out loud. I'm filing for divorce, I said. I can't stay with someone who's capable of this kind of manipulation. She didn't just cheat, she treated our marriage like a game. Jasmine nodded. I'm divorcing Steve too. There's no coming back from this. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of direction, even if it came with a heavy heart. This was the beginning of the end, not just for my marriage, but for the life I thought I had. I got home late that night, my head still spinning from everything I'd learned. Vicky was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like it was just another normal evening. The sight of her made my stomach turn. She looked up and smiled. Hey, you're home late. Everything okay? For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the person I had just heard on that recording. No, Vicky, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Everything is not okay. Her brow furrowed. What's wrong? I tossed the manila folder from Mike onto the coffee table in front of her. Why don't you take a look? She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the folder. Finally, she picked it up and started flipping through the pages. Her face went pale as she realized what it was, flight records, hotel bookings, photos. What is this? She asked, her voice shaking. It's proof, I said, my anger bubbling to the surface. Proof of what you've been doing with Steve for the past 6 years. Proof of the lies, the cheating, the betrayal. And if that's not enough, I've got a recording of you admitting to the whole thing. Her hands trembled as she put the folder down. Dawn, I cut her off. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I heard you, Vicky. I heard you say this wasn't even about Steve. It was about proving you could get away with it. What kind of person does that? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her, not this time. I made a mistake, she stammered. I was selfish, and I let things get out of hand, but it didn't mean anything. I love you, Dawn. Love? I laughed bitterly. You don't destroy someone you love. You don't gamble 6 years of marriage just to prove a point. You don't lie to their face over and over again. She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back. Back. Dawn, please. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes, counseling, therapy, whatever you want. No, I said firmly. I'm done. You've been lying to me for years, and I can't trust you anymore. You didn't just break my heart, you shattered my entire life. We're over, Vicky. Her tears turned to anger. So that's it? You're just going to throw everything away without even trying? I didn't throw anything away, I shot back. You did the moment you decided to make our marriage some twisted game. You threw it all away. For the first time, she didn't have a response. She just sat there, staring at me, as I turned and walked upstairs to pack a bag. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I wanted the divorce process to start as soon as possible. Vicky didn't try to stop me when I left the house. Maybe she was still processing the fact that her carefully constructed lies had finally unraveled. Jasmine and I kept in touch during those first few days, leaning on each other as we navigated the chaos. She had filed for divorce from Steve too, and while her anger was quieter than mine, it was just as deep. 2 days after the confrontation, Vicky showed up at my office unannounced. My assistant buzzed in to warn me, but before I could respond, Vicky was already in the doorway. "Dawn, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm but her face streaked with the remnants of tears. "I don't think there's anything left to say," I replied coldly. She closed the door behind her and took a step closer to my desk. "I know I can't undo what I did, but you're throwing away 10 years of marriage, Dawn. Are you really okay with that?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You're the one who threw it away, Vicky. I'm just cleaning up the mess." Her expression softened, and for a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I fell in love with all those years ago. "I made a mistake, a terrible one, but I didn't mean to hurt you. It wasn't about you. It was about me." "That's the problem," I snapped. "You didn't think about me or us or what we built together. You only thought about yourself." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked truly defeated. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "You already did," I said, my voice quiet but resolute. She stood there for a moment, as if waiting for me to change my mind. When it became clear I wasn't going to, she turned and left without another word. Jasmine and I met for coffee that afternoon, both of us needing a break from the whirlwind of emotions. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "How are you holding up?" she asked as I sat down. I shrugged. "It's a mess. Vicky came to my office this morning, trying to, I don't even know, fix things, I guess." Jasmine nodded. "Steve called me last night. He wanted to talk, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I'm done with his lies." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our shared experiences hanging heavy in the air. "I never thought I'd end up here," I said finally. "Divorcing the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with." "Me neither," Jasmine replied. "But maybe this is a chance for something better." Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope amid the pain. The next few weeks were chaos, lawyers, paperwork, dividing assets. It all felt like a second job. Vicky tried to stall the divorce, dragging out negotiations by refusing to agree on terms. Every email from her lawyer felt like another punch to the gut. Jasmine wasn't faring much better. Steve, apparently blindsided by her decision to leave, was pulling every manipulative move in the book. One day, Jasmine called me, her voice tight with frustration. "Steve's trying to convince me to go to counseling," she said. "Not because he's sorry. He keeps saying we should protect our image, like that's more important than what he did." "That sounds about right," I muttered. "Vicky's been doing the same thing, acting like we can just patch this up and move on." We were both exhausted, but there was something comforting about knowing we weren't going through it alone. One evening, I decided to clean out the spare room at the house. It was mostly junk, old files, tools, and a few forgotten photo albums. As I flipped through one of the albums, I came across a picture from our anniversary trip to Hawaii a few years back. Vicky and I were smiling, arms around each other with the ocean behind us. I stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the woman in it with the person I'd come to know over the past few weeks. My grip tightened, and before I knew it, I'd ripped the picture in half. It felt good, cathartic, even. So I kept going. I tore through the album, page by page, until it was nothing but a pile of shredded memories. When I was done, I sat back, breathing heavily. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Jasmine and I had started to spend more time together. At first, it was just phone calls and coffee meetings to vent about the legal process. But eventually, we began to open up about more than just the betrayals. One night, she invited me over for dinner. "Just something simple," she said. I figured we could both use a break. Her home felt warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness I felt every time I stepped into my own house. As we ate, the conversation shifted from our exes to our lives before everything fell apart. "I used to love painting," Jasmine admitted, a small smile playing on her lips. "I haven't touched a canvas in years, though." "You should pick it up again," I said. "It sounds like something that made you happy." She looked at me, her smile fading slightly. "It's hard to think about being happy right now." "I get that," I replied, "but maybe we both need to start thinking about what comes next. About what makes us happy." She nodded, and for the first time, I saw a spark of hope in her eyes. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about Jasmine, about how strong she'd been, even in the face of everything Steve had put her through, and about how, somehow, she was helping me find my own strength. Jasmine and I started meeting more frequently after that dinner. At first, it was just a way to escape the mess our lives had become, but slowly, something shifted. Our conversations became lighter, less focused on the betrayals, and more about who we were outside of our failed marriages. One evening, she invited me to a park near her house. "I've been cooped up inside too much," she said over the phone. "Fresh air might do us both some good." When I arrived, she was sitting on a bench with a small sketch pad in her lap. She looked up and smiled. "You're late," she teased. "Traffic," I replied, though we both knew that was a lie. I'd spent 10 minutes sitting in my truck debating whether I should go. We walked for a while, Jasmine talking about nothing in particular. At one point, she handed me the sketchpad I'd been practicing on. "These are incredible," I said honestly. "You've got talent, Jasmine." Her voice was tinged with both pride and nervousness as she flipped through the pages, revealing beautiful landscapes, flowers, and even a rough but striking portrait of what looked like her husband, though she'd scribbled over his face. She shrugged, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. "It's just something to keep me busy." "No," I said, stopping in my tracks. "It's more than that. You've got something here. Don't downplay it." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally smiling. "Thanks, Don, that means a lot." A few days later, Vicky called. I let it go to voicemail at first, but curiosity got the better of me, and I listened to the message. "Don," she began, her voice shaky. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I've done things you'll never forgive, but I need to see you just one more time. Please, for old time's sake. There's something I need to say in person." I stared at my phone, torn. Part of me wanted to tell her to shove it, but another part, a quieter, more sentimental part, wanted closure. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Vicky was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth by the window. She looked tired, her makeup doing little to hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Thanks for coming," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "What do you want, Vicky?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, fiddling with her coffee cup. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally, her voice soft. "For everything. For the lies, the affair, the pain I caused you. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I needed to say it." I studied her face, searching for any trace of manipulation, but all I saw was regret. "Why now?" I asked. "Why not 6 years ago when you started all this?" She looked down at her hands. "Because I was too selfish to admit I was wrong. I told myself I could have it all, that I could love you and still do what I was doing. But I was wrong. I see that now." Her words hit me harder than I expected, not because I wanted to forgive her, but because part of me realized she was being sincere. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But it doesn't change anything. We're done." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I hope you find someone who makes you happy. Someone who can give you the love you deserve." I didn't respond. What was there to say? That night, I found myself thinking about Jasmine again, about how she'd been there for me, even when her own world was falling apart. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe when I was around her. Maybe I was right, maybe I could find happiness again. The days blurred together, a mix of legal meetings, work, and moments of quiet reflection. The ache from Vicky's betrayal was still there, but it had dulled into something more manageable, a constant background hum rather than a sharp stabbing pain. Jasmine called one afternoon, her voice lighter than usual. "I need a break," she said. "Come with me to the art exhibit downtown. It's been years since I've gone, and I don't want to go alone." At first, I hesitated. Art wasn't exactly my thing, but the idea of spending time with her was enough to make me say yes. The exhibit was in a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial lighting. Jasmine was in her element, her eyes lighting up as she moved from piece to piece. She explained the techniques, the emotions behind the works, and I found myself more captivated by her enthusiasm than the art itself. At one point, we stopped in front of a massive abstract painting, bold streaks of red and black that seemed chaotic yet purposeful. "What do you think?" she asked, tilting her head as she studied the piece. I chuckled. "Honestly, it looks like a paint fight gone wrong." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Maybe, but look closer. There's a pattern, a rhythm to it. It's messy, sure, but there's beauty in the mess." I glanced at her, realizing she wasn't just talking about the painting. After the exhibit, we grabbed dinner at a nearby cafe. The conversation flowed easily, the weight of our pasts feeling a little lighter with each passing moment. "You know," Jasmine said as we finished our meal, "I didn't think I'd ever feel normal again after all this, but being here with you. It feels good." Her words caught me off guard. "Yeah," I admitted. "It does." We walked back to our cars in comfortable silence, the night air crisp and cool. As we reached her car, she turned to me, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Don, I know we're both still healing, and I don't want to rush anything, but I like spending time with you. I like who I am when I'm around you." I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. "I feel the same way," I said. She smiled, a mix of relief and hope in her eyes. "Then let's see where this goes." The next morning, I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in months, optimism. Jasmine and I weren't rushing into anything, but there was a sense of possibility that made the future seem a little brighter. Vicky, of course, wasn't making things easy. She'd started leaving voicemails again, long, rambling apologies mixed with pleas to give her another chance. I deleted them without listening. She'd had her chance, and she'd thrown it away. Meanwhile, Steve was still trying to manipulate Jasmine. He'd sent her flowers, left notes on her car, and even showed up uninvited at her work. But Jasmine was done playing his games. She'd filed a restraining order, and seeing her stand up to him made me respect her even more. That weekend, Jasmine invited me over for dinner. This time, it wasn't just the two of us. Her sister Claire was visiting and wanted to meet the guy Jasmine kept talking about. The evening was easy and warm, filled with laughter and good food. Claire was sharp and funny, teasing Jasmine mercilessly about her newfound hobby of sketching everything in sight. As the night wound down, Claire pulled me aside while Jasmine was in the kitchen. "Thank you," she said, her tone serious. "For what?" I asked. "For being there for her. She hasn't smiled this much in years. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Her words stayed with me long after I left. Maybe Jasmine and I were still figuring things out, but for the first time, I felt like we were building something real, something worth fighting for. Things with Jasmine were going better than I could have imagined. We were taking it slow, but each day brought us closer together. For the first time since Vicky's betrayal, I felt like I could see a future, a good one. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. One evening, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me, and I listened to the message. "Don, it's Steve," the voice began. I froze. "Look, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but you need to know what Jasmine's been saying about you. She's not as innocent as you think. Call me if you want the truth." I deleted the message, but his words stuck in my head like a splinter. Was this another one of his manipulations, or was there something Jasmine hadn't told me? The next day, I brought it up with Jasmine. We were sitting on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon when I finally worked up the nerve. "Steve called me," I said, keeping my tone even. Her expression darkened immediately. "What did he want?" "He said you've been talking about me, that you're not as innocent as I think." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Don, you know he's just trying to mess with us. He can't stand that I've moved on." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. "But is there anything I should know? Anything he might use against you, or us?" She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. I told Steve the truth about what happened between us, how I felt like a fool for trusting him, how I never wanted to see him again. If he's twisting my words, that's on him. Her honesty reassured me, but Steve's call had planted a seed of doubt, not in Jasmine, but in the fragility of what we were building. A week later, Vicky showed up at my house, uninvited. She was standing on the porch when I pulled into the driveway, looking disheveled and desperate. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my irritation clear. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, Don, just hear me out." I sighed and stepped inside, leaving the door open for her to follow. She launched into a long, rambling monologue about how much she regretted what she'd done, how she wanted to make things right, how she still loved me. "I can't do this, Vicky," I said when she finally paused to catch her breath. "You made your choice, and I've made mine. It's over." She reached for my hand, her eyes filled with tears. "It doesn't have to be. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Don. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just say the word." I pulled my hand away. "The word is goodbye, Vicky. It's too late for anything else." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the recording, the lies, the years of deceit, and my resolve hardened. She left without another word, and I stood at the window watching her car disappear down the street. That night, I called Jasmine. I didn't tell her about Vicky's visit, she didn't need the extra stress, but hearing her voice helped steady me. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. "Dawn, no matter what they try to throw at us, we've got this." I wanted to believe her. A few days later, things took a darker turn. Steve wasn't content to just call and leave cryptic messages. He started showing up unannounced at Jasmine's work, her home, even once at the coffee shop we frequented. The first time she brushed it off. "He's trying to intimidate me," she said, "but I'm not letting him get to me." The second time, she seemed rattled. "Don, this is getting out of hand. He won't leave me alone." The third time, I told her we couldn't just ignore it anymore. "File another restraining order," I urged. "If he violates it, he'll face real consequences." She nodded, her resolve firming. "You're right. I'm done playing his games." Meanwhile, Vicky ramped up her efforts to win me back. She started calling my friends and family, trying to recruit them as allies. One evening, my mom called me, her voice tight with concern. "Don, Vicky called me. She said she sounded desperate. She says she wants another chance." "Mom, I'm not interested," I replied. "She's only reaching out because she knows she's lost control." My mom hesitated. "I know you've been hurt, but are you sure this is the right decision? Marriage is about forgiveness." I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm. "This isn't just about forgiveness, Mom. It's about trust, and she destroyed it. I can't go back." There was a long pause before she finally said, "I understand. I just want you to be happy." "I will be," I said, "eventually." Jasmine called later that night, her voice shaky. "Don, Steve showed up at my house again. He was banging on the door, shouting for me to come out." I was so scared I almost called the police, but he left before I could. That's it, I said, my anger boiling over. We're not waiting for him to escalate further. I'll go with you to the courthouse tomorrow to file the restraining order. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know what I'd do without you. The next day, we went to the courthouse together. Jasmine's hands trembled as she filled out the paperwork, but she didn't falter. Are you sure you want to do this? The clerk asked, glancing at the form. Yes, Jasmine said firmly. I can't live like this anymore. Afterward, we went to a nearby park and sat on a bench, watching the ducks paddle across the pond. I hate that he still has this power over me, she admitted. He doesn't, I said. Not anymore. You're taking control back, one step at a time. She looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. You're a good man, Dawn. Better than I deserve. Don't say that, I replied. You deserve happiness just as much as anyone else. She smiled, a small but genuine smile that made my chest feel a little lighter. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how much had changed in such a short time. My life had been torn apart, but piece by piece, I was rebuilding it. And Jasmine was becoming a bigger part of that picture every day. But I also knew we weren't out of the woods yet. Not with Steve still lurking in the shadows and not with Vicky's constant attempts to claw her way back into my life. I resolved to stay strong for myself, for Jasmine, and for the future we were starting to imagine together. The restraining order didn't stop Steve. A week later, Jasmine called me in tears. He showed up at my work, she said, her voice trembling. He waited in the parking lot, and when I came out, he followed me to my car. He kept saying we needed to talk, that I was overreacting. Dawn, I thought he was going to grab me. I gripped the phone tightly, my anger rising. Did you call the police? Not yet, she admitted. I drove straight to a friend's house, but I don't know what to do. What if he doesn't stop? We'll make him stop, I said firmly. I'll handle it. The next day, I called Mike, the private investigator who had uncovered Vicky and Steve's affair. He was a no-nonsense guy, and I trusted him to help. I need you to look into Steve, I told him. Find out what he's been up to, and if there's anything we can use to keep him away from Jasmine. Mike didn't ask questions. Consider it done, he said. In the meantime, I stayed by Jasmine's side as much as I could. We spent most evenings together at her place, keeping the lights low and the doors locked. I hated seeing her like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, flinching at every unexpected sound. One night, as we sat on her couch, she turned to me, her eyes filled with worry. Dawn, what if he never stops? What if this is my life now? It won't be, I said, taking her hand. We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this. Her lips trembled, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. A few days later, Mike called with an update. You're not going to believe this, he said. Steve's got a lot more skeletons in his closet than just an affair. What do you mean? He's got a history of shady business deals, unpaid debts, and some domestic disturbances with Jasmine that never made it to court. This guy is a ticking time bomb. If you want to hit him where it hurts, we can use this. I felt a grim satisfaction. Do it. Whatever it takes to keep him away from her. The next morning, Mike filed a report with Jasmine's lawyer and submitted it to the court handling her restraining order. The evidence painted a damning picture of Steve, showing a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. A few days later, the court issued a formal order that not only enforced the restraining order but also warned Steve that any further violations would result in immediate jail time. When Jasmine heard the news, she cried, not out of fear, but out of relief. He can't touch me now, she said, her voice shaky but hopeful. I can finally breathe again. That night, we celebrated with a quiet dinner at my place. For the first time in weeks, Jasmine seemed relaxed, her laughter coming easily as we finished our meal. She reached across the table and took my hand. Dawn, I don't know what I would have done without you. You've been my rock through all of this. I squeezed her hand, my chest tightening. You've been just as strong, Jasmine. We've gotten through this together. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the world felt still. I think I'm falling for you, she said quietly. My breath caught, but I didn't hesitate. I think I'm falling for you too. After the court's warning, Steve went quiet. No phone calls, no surprise visits, nothing. For the first time in weeks, Jasmine and I felt a sense of peace. Jasmine started painting again, transforming her living room into a makeshift studio. She was happier, more vibrant, and it was infectious. Watching her rediscover a part of herself was like seeing a light turned back on in her life. One evening, I stopped by her place after work and found her covered in streaks of paint, standing proudly in front of a nearly finished canvas. What do you think? She asked, her cheeks flushed with excitement. The painting was bold and colorful, a chaotic swirl of blues and oranges. It's incredible, I said honestly. You've got real talent, Jasmine. She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no trace of fear or sadness in her eyes. Things with Vicky, on the other hand, were less peaceful. She'd started sending handwritten letters, each one more desperate than the last. I didn't read most of them, but one caught my eye because of its opening line. I'll sign the divorce papers, but you owe me a conversation first. I debated whether to respond, but in the end, I decided to meet her, not for her sake, but for mine. I needed to close this chapter for good. We met at a park we used to visit early in our marriage. Vicky was already there, sitting on a bench under a large oak tree. She looked tired, like the weight of everything. She had finally caught up to me. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said as I approached. "I'm not here to change my mind," I replied, sitting down. "I just want to move on, Vicky, and I need you to let me." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've signed the papers," she said. "I won't fight you on anything. You deserve to be free of this." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she turned to me, her eyes shining with tears. "I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't blame you. But for what it's worth, I am sorry, Dawn. Truly." Her words were sincere, but they didn't change anything. "I accept your apology," I said, my voice steady. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I'll never forget what you did, and I can't live with someone I can't trust." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy between us. Then, without another word, I stood up and walked away. That night, I told Jasmine about the meeting. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine. "Do you feel better now?" she asked. "Yeah," I admitted, "I think I do." She smiled. "Good. You deserve that." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of progress. The divorce was finalized, and I felt a sense of relief I hadn't realized I was waiting for. Jasmine and I grew closer, spending more time together and opening up about our hopes for the future. One evening, as we sat on her porch watching the stars, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked. "All the time," I said. "I used to think my future was set, business, marriage, family, but now I'm not so sure." She nodded. "Me too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing is part of the adventure." Her words stayed with me long after I left. For the first time in a long time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt like an opportunity, a chance to build something new. With the divorce behind me, life began to feel lighter. Jasmine and I continued spending time together, finding comfort in each other's company. One evening, we sat in her living room, her latest painting drying on the easel nearby. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked suddenly. "Regret?" I repeated. "I regret trusting someone who didn't deserve it. But I don't regret finding out. It gave me a chance to start over." She smiled softly. "Starting over doesn't feel so bad anymore." It was true, every day felt like a step towards something better. Later that week, Vicky sent one last message, a simple note saying she wished me happiness. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The past was finally behind me. Jasmine and I spent the weekend hiking a nearby trail, laughing and talking as if the weight of everything had lifted. At the summit, as we looked out over the valley, I realized something. I was finally happy again. Jasmine and I settled into a rhythm that felt natural, almost effortless. We weren't rushing anything, but there was a comfort in knowing we were both committed to moving forward together. One evening, we went to a small outdoor concert downtown. The music was lively, the kind that made people get up and dance, and for a while, we just sat and watched. Then Jasmine nudged me. "Come on," she said with a grin. "I'm not much of a dancer," I warned her. "Neither am I," she replied, grabbing my hand and pulling me to my feet. We laughed our way through the song, tripping over each other's feet and drawing amused looks from the crowd. By the end, I was breathless, but it felt good, really good. As we sat back down, Jasmine leaned her head on my shoulder. "This is nice," she said softly. "It is," I agreed, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. The next day, I got a call from Carl, my best friend. "Hey, man, how are things?" he asked. "Better," I admitted. "It's been a rough year, but I think I'm finally turning a corner." He hesitated. "You deserve it, Dawn. I've been meaning to say I'm proud of you for how you've handled everything. A lot of people would have let it break them." His words caught me off guard. "Thanks, Carl. That means a lot." "Don't mention it," he said. "Just don't forget to invite me over when you're ready to celebrate the next chapter." That evening, Jasmine and I cooked dinner together at my place. She chopped vegetables while I grilled chicken, and we talked about everything, from childhood memories to future dreams. "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" she asked as we sat down to eat. I thought about it for a moment. Hopefully still running my business, maybe traveling more. And I'd like to build a home again, not just a house, but a real home. Her eyes softened. "That sounds nice. What about you?" I asked. She smiled. "I just want to keep painting, to find some kind of peace, and maybe someone to share it with." The unspoken words hung in the air, but neither of us needed to say them. We were already building something together, even if it was still in the early stages. The next morning, as I watched the sunrise from my porch, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Months passed, and life felt steady, even happy. Jasmine and I had created a bond built on trust and shared healing. One quiet evening, as we walked along the river, I stopped and turned to her. "Jasmine, you've brought light back into my life. I never thought I could feel this way again." She looked at me, her eyes shining. "You've done the same for me, Dawn." Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a small box. Her hand flew to her mouth as I opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. I know we've both been through hell, but I believe we can build something beautiful together. Will you marry me? Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. Yes, Don. 1,000 times yes. We stood there, holding each other as the river flowed quietly beside us, ready to start the next chapter of our lives.